When we talk about privatization, we have to talk about deregulation. It's part of the package of economic policies, but they're intimately related. This latest example, again, just to snatch from the headlines this week, American Airlines, not the airline, but the US Airlines, have yanked hundreds of planes out of service in the past 4, 5, 6 days because the Transportation Committee held hearings and a whistleblower from inside the FAA, the federal regulator for aviation, exposed the cozy relationship between the regulator and the airlines. And time again, there were examples of US airlines violating safety standards, getting caught, and the federal regulator burying it and letting the planes keep flying out of concern for the bottom line of the airlines. And they were explicit about it. Regulators in our society today, whether it's the food industry in Canada, or the airline industry in the United States, or the CRTC, see themselves as partners, that's a polite word, bedfellows, maybe a little closer, cheerleaders is often how it seems, for the very industries that they are supposed to be regulating in the public interest. So this whistleblower spoke up about the relationship between the FAA and the airlines, and many lives may have been saved by that single act. But do we want airline safety to be at the whim of the occasional whistleblower scandal? And there's another kind of lovely fad in the deregulation industry these days, which is self-regulation. I had the only other time I've been in Canada in the last 3 months was at a very strange gig, which I took sort of for the novelty of it. A group of big charities that work on the prevention of chronic illnesses, diabetes, heart and stroke, etc., held a public policy conference on the obesity epidemic and the effect of marketing unhealthy food and drinks to kids. And that's a subject I've been interested in since Naomi turned me on to it, as she has so many things, when she wrote the book No Logo in 2000 and started to look at the incursions of marketing in our culture, which since that time, I mean, frankly, have just exploded. So it turned out that I was actually chairing a sort of citizens' jury, and we heard a day of evidence from experts on the effect of marketing to kids and the connection with the obesity epidemic in this country, which is really a public health emergency. And we were to come up with public policy prescriptions about what the government ought to do. So first of all, half the panels were stacked with industry spokespeople. They prevented us from accessing any research in advance. Myself and other panel members, we were begging them for background research so that we could go into this complex subject with as much homework as we could under our belts, and the industry representatives on the industry subcommittee prevented us from accessing the background papers created by the organization itself so that they could control our citizens' reaction based on what happened in the room that day. That would be all the information we could get, and more than half of the participants were industry spokespeople. But what I learned, and what my fellow citizens learned, was that when it comes to regulating marketing to kids in the food and beverage industry, the industry is entirely self-regulating. Entirely voluntary self-regulation. We have an obesity epidemic in Canada, and the system, really taken into hyperdrive by the Chrétien Martin government, starting in the mid-90s, or sort of ending in the mid-90s, this process, is for industry to regulate itself. It is food companies, the big ones, Kraft, General Mills, who in their special voluntary initiative around children and marketing decide that they are only going to market healthy choices to children. And they decide what healthy choices are. And they include Fruit Loops. I'm not kidding. So when we talk about privatization, we have to talk about a society in which corporations police themselves. I think you've got the same problem with the energy industry here in Alberta. We're still waiting for that multi-sectoral agency, CEMA, is it CEMA, who's going to decide what are the real environmental parameters of tar sands development. They're going to get back to us as soon as they can achieve consensus. with industry and environmentalists at the same table. So that's heartening. When we talk about privatization, we have to talk about tax cuts. We have to talk about the most fundamental shift in the balance of power in society, I believe, in Canadian history. Murray Dobbin did a great calculation recently and just tallied up the tax cuts. And he points out that the federal government voluntarily gave up $250 billion in taxes between '84 and 2006. And then the Flaherty-Martin team adds another $60 billion of tax cuts in the next 5 years, and you have $1/3 trillion in a single generation that has been shifted out of government and shifted out of government's ability to regulate corporations, provide universal health care, have daycare, fulfill the promise of pharmacare, address our infrastructure deficit, do all of the things that everybody in Canada knows need to be done. A voluntary downsizing of government. That's what tax cuts are. And we can't talk about privatization if we're not talking about that. And I also have, there's a million things that I could list here, but there's one more I want to throw on the pile. I don't think we can really talk about privatization unless we talk about gentrification. We're living in a period of unbelievable inequality, where we have pockets of what some investment bankers in New York call the plutonomy, where the top 1% of the top 1% enjoy a staggering lifestyle of glittering brilliance that all of us see are surrounded by in popular culture, and yet very few of us can actually afford. But when you go to the downtowns of big cities or the places where growth is taking place, you enter a world of enormous, sparkling privilege, which is right there and yet entirely out of reach for the vast majority of citizens. And the real estate boom, which is coming to an end now, over the last 15 years, has shoved huge numbers of poor people out of the most desirable neighborhoods, whether it's Baltimore or Key West or Toronto or Halifax. I don't know how it is here. But you have the displacement of numbers of people, the gentrification of neighborhoods, and this long-lasting project which divides, where the wealth divide in society is right there in the storefront, is right there on the sidewalk, where panhandlers have been made illegal, is right there where people don't have access to public space because they've been privatized and corporatized, and it's private security on the previously public square, where the meeting place is the mall, which is not a democratic space, and where the privileged bubble detaches itself from the rest of society. I was in New Orleans in early January. And what's happening in that city 2.5 years after Katrina is it just lays your heart to waste. You know, the city is half its size. And the city is sending every conceivable signal to the poor, largely African-American, virtually exclusively African-American displaced population that there is no New Orleans for you to come back to. The lower Ninth Ward, which was a poor neighborhood, but a working class black neighborhood, where generations of people raised their families and sat on their stoops, is just empty. There are whole blocks, scores of blocks, where the houses were demolished, nothing is being rebuilt, and it's returned to swampland. There are fields with wild grass where people used to live. It's almost post-apocalyptic. And they started in the last few months in New Orleans destroying 4,700 units of public housing under the guise of reinvigorating the nasty projects and tearing down the slums and building mixed income communities that will be integrated and be, the fact is that there were 5,000 families in public housing in New Orleans before Katrina, and there'll be room for a tiny, tiny fraction of them in affordable housing when this process is done, if it's ever done. They've locked up magnificent old brick buildings that had a little bit of water damage on the ground floor. And the people who stayed or came back are banging on the gates, are breaking in to go and fix their own homes. And they're thrown out. and told that these public housing developments are unrecoverable and have to be destroyed. So when the wrecking ball starts smashing into low-income housing, that's part of privatization too. When the only hospital in New Orleans, Charity Hospital, that served the uninsured, that huge swath of the American population that doesn't have health insurance, was closed because of Katrina and was never reopened, and is clearly never going to be reopened. That's privatization too, taking the bubbles and making them permanent.